We have a guest in the studio and a guest visiting us from Seoul, South Korea. He's been in the country for an entire week. Dr. Jerome Kim is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Do you know what that is? He'll tell you more about it. Let's welcome him with the day's proverb. This one is from Namibia.
The country of Namibia, whose capital, as Ndu told me, it is written Windhoek, but it's pronounced Windhoek.
Windhoek.
Yes.
Well done.
That
breathing out.
Yeah, Windhoek. Okay.
Envy and greed grow from the same stalk.
Envy and greed grow from the same stalk. All right. Dr. Jerome Kim, good morning.
Good morning. It's
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here.
We call that the hot seat of the Situation Room. So make yourself comfortable. It's going to be a smooth ride. We may experience some turbulence at some point, but don't worry. Nothing to worry about.
Thanks. I know I'm in good hands.
Yes, you are. Let's begin with that proverb from Namibia. Do you relate with the proverb?
I think, my an IVIs Philosophy, the institute, the International Vaccine Institute, really are trying to work to alleviate the consequences of inequity. And inequity, of course, has its root in envy and greed.
In envy and greed.
And so, and I think as a personal philosophy, to do all the good that you can, whenever you can, with whomever you can, I think is a good approach. You don't need a New Year's resolution for that. You can do it every day of your life.
Sure.
It's a daily thing. Tell us about the International Vaccine Institute.
IVI, or the International Vaccine Institute, was founded as an initiative of the United Nations Development Program 26 years ago. Unfortunately, a few weeks after they founded the institute, they withdrew. But
who withdrew? UNDP?
The UNDP. But despite that, the government of Korea, the government of Sweden, and other countries that are member states contributed funding to allow the institute to continue. And then, of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation started its very large program of philanthropic efforts to develop new vaccines. And so IVI was well positioned to help in that. We have a mission to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. And we've been able to do that. We're one of the few organizations funded by the Gates Foundation to actually get vaccines approved. So a vaccine starts in a laboratory at IVI, is technology transferred to many companies around the world, is then made by those companies, and we work with those companies to get the vaccines approved and then ultimately used globally for diseases like cholera and typhoid. So we now have 2 approved vaccines. A very important part of what IVI considers its key mission. We don't have any patents. And for public health purposes, there are no licensing fees. So these vaccines are really readily available and given because the countries that founded IVI believe that better health through vaccination is a public good.
Sure. So which vaccines are we looking at here? Are we certain cohorts of vaccines or across board?
So IVI works on a lot of vaccines. The vaccines that came out of our laboratory are the cholera vaccine. So when you hear that there's a cholera outbreak in, say, Sudan or in Yemen,
there's one in Kenya.
There's one in Kenya currently.
The vaccine that will be used in outbreaks is actually 90% of the vaccine in the stockpile comes from the original technology transfers from IVI to Shanta, which is an Indian company, and now U Biologics, which was a small Korean company that had never really done vaccines before, and now is the largest supplier of cholera vaccine to the world. And there's a shortage, unfortunately.
Sure. So how do you decide? Because, let's just look at one disease that grabbed the world by storm, COVID. How do you decide, or how does IVI decide then which you will go into?
That's a great question. So we every 5 years come up with a new strategy, and the board of trustees, IVI has a board. It's a little unusual as an international organization to actually not have a functioning general assembly, but to have a board of trustees. But the board of trustees approves the strategy and then gives the management a fair amount of leeway to conduct research and development of vaccines that are necessary for global health. And for COVID, we actually sat down in early February of 2020 and thought really carefully about what our role should be. And we decided not to pursue our own vaccine. Not because we couldn't, but because we thought that it was going to be important to help companies, small biotechs, large multinational corporations to get vaccines approved as quickly as possible and to then have them enter the stockpile or something called COVAX eventually, which was formed later in the year, to make it available for countries around the world that would have trouble otherwise to access vaccines. So in the end, we helped 24 companies and philanthropic organizations and countries with the capacity to develop vaccines, COVID vaccines.
COVID.
And I think that, in the end, the vaccines that IVI worked on in phase 3, the final stage of testing, contributed about 1 billion doses to COVAX. And so as a legacy for our participation in the pandemic, helping different companies get vaccines approved so that they would be made available for global use, I think is important and makes the point that it's not about an IVI vaccine. It's about vaccines and ultimately about vaccination.
Getting people healthy. So IVI was, like you said, initiated by UNDP, and then UNDP pulled out. So now there are member countries, member states into IVI. How many member states do you have, and what's the importance of being a member state?
So there are 39, and the World Health Organization as member states. Not all the member states many of them are still in the process of completing joining IVI. And a few of the member states actually contribute funding. So about 20% of our funding comes from Korea, Sweden, India, Finland, and soon Austria. Countries like Denmark actually donate money but are not yet members. But then the rest of the 80% of our funding comes from grants with the Gates Foundation, with the Wellcome Trust, and with an organization called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And our goal sometimes is to identify a vaccine that we can start in the laboratory and move forward, like the cholera vaccine or the typhoid vaccine. The other would be to partner with small companies that would otherwise not be able to finish the process of developing a vaccine, which can be expensive, can be complicated if the small company has never really gone through the process of getting a vaccine approved by the World Health Organization, then we can help with that. If they need help getting the vaccine recommended by World Health Organization bodies or regional regulatory technical advisory groups, then IVI can help with that. I mean, our role is to be a facilitator and to fill gaps. So when we started, there wasn't a readily accessible cholera vaccine or readily accessible typhoid conjugate vaccine. So we filled those gaps.
So what's the expectation of a member state? So there are 36 member states who are, some of them fully admitted, others in the process of admission, but only a handful are contributing the 20%.
Yes. And
so what's the point of being a member state?
That's actually, one of the key points of the new strategy is more significant engagement of member states. And I think it's the easiest way to think about it is this way. The Board of Trustees of IVI is composed of 10 at-large members and then representatives from the member states that are funding IVI.
Okay.
Last year, we recognized that this is not a good way to run an international organization because there's no input from countries where IVI works that are member states but aren't contributors.
So they're beneficiaries, but they're not contributing.
Right. And they're not a part of the governance of the Institute.
Yeah.
So last year, we changed the Constitution to allow 2 non-funding countries who are member states to join the board. So Rwanda and Ecuador each now send government representatives to sit on the board. So now we have some input. And then at the same time, we created a new entity called the Global Council, which is supposed to now be our first attempt to create something like a General Assembly that will make recommendations to the board and that will eventually pick the member states that are non-funding that will sit on the board.
Okay.
And the idea would be that between the board and the Global Council, this opportunity to collaborate and to express the will of the group is going to be very important because the difference between an international organization and a non-governmental organization, say in Europe or in Asia, is that we are really participatory. We're supposed to represent the will of the countries that feel similarly about the need for vaccines, vaccination, and public health. And we weren't doing it. And I think we're taking the first steps now to becoming a real international organization with real participation from countries around the world. And that is very important.
Is there going to be a strong voice from the weak countries? I mean, those non-contributing countries, they only get 2 seats on the board.
So the board does things by consensus. So to the extent that Ecuador, which actually sent its Minister of Health to join the board, and Rwanda, which sent a professor from the University of Rwanda to join the board, I think we will. And there is very active participation. And again, when things are brought up, we have to get agreement. And each of the board members has that ability to speak and express his opinion or her opinion on behalf of their country, or in the case of the board members who are not from, who are at large, their own personal opinions. And so, for instance, one of the board members, Jean-Marie Aquabelle, is a former WHO leader and is from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we hope that the needs and desires of countries that are not funders are going to be expressed. And even before the Global Council, we had an annual state forum where countries were invited and would come to actually voice their most significant concerns. And different regions have different issues.
Sure. One of the things you spoke about in the very beginning was, being an organization then that is hinged on making sure that there is equity when it comes to vaccines around the world. Yes. One of the big conversations, and again, looking at our most, recent example, is COVID. And one of the huge things that happened was when we started using, really gross terms like vaccine apartheid. And we started using, because unfortunately that's what was happening. That even now as you speak about representation of the more silent countries, or those who are not as economically muscled as others, the truth of the matter is that when it then comes to the doling out of the vaccines that could essentially be life-saving, these countries get the short end of the stick. What is the approach to saying that moving forward, or conversations being had to make sure that something that could be possibly life-saving is not then kept away from those who don't have the financial muscle?
That is a great point, and it highlights one of the most important learnings from the pandemic, and one against which we're making slow progress, and we should speed it up. If you think about the 4 gaps, that may be the easiest way, because it's not just a pandemic about the vaccine. It actually is, the response to the pandemic is much broader. So if you think about the four gaps, the first gap was in diagnostics. You're not going to be able to know a pandemic is in Kenya unless you have appropriate diagnostics. And, there was a report, I think it was in May or so of 2020, where a study of blood banks in Kenya revealed a much higher level of positivity than the government knew about. And actually, the government commissioned this study because they were really curious about, what the actual burden of disease was. So diagnostics were a big gap, a $2 billion gap. That was never addressed. The second gap is around vaccine manufacturing and vaccine supply. And I think we all saw that the global north, the vast majority of vaccines are manufactured in North America, Europe, India, and China.
Yeah.
And we saw the impact of what we call vaccine nationalism, which is actually not new. The Korean government experienced it for the first time in 2010 when it was told by the U.S. government that vaccine it had purchased for pandemic influenza might not be delivered because the U.S. government had the right to use the vaccine manufactured in the United States for its own purposes. Does that sound familiar? And as a result, Korea started a 15-year program to develop its vaccine industry to become 80% self-sufficient in vaccines and to become the number 5 vaccine producer in the world. Now, at that time, it was number 11. So, but that's the kind of thing that governments will do around manufacturing. And the final issue is, the third gap is a vaccination gap. So what we found out starting around July and August of 2021 was, we were making billions of doses of vaccine. By the end of 2021, they had made 13 billion doses of vaccine, which is an enormous number. Average year, we make 500 million doses of flu vaccine. I mean, we made 13 billion doses of COVID vaccines. And yet, even today, 70% of people in low-income countries have not been vaccinated. So that vaccination gap, more than the vaccine gap, is something that is a real issue. And it gets to a really important problem in health infrastructure and funding for ministries of health to deliver necessary health care. And the final gap, and you'll see this one in all of the other gaps, is a leadership gap, a global leadership gap. Who was in charge of the response to the global pandemic? This wasn't like something that's moving very slowly, where you can get countries that agree to sit at a table and very, conveniently discuss and sanely discuss a problem. This was happening quickly. It was like a forest fire.
Yeah.
And who was in charge? I mean, if you have a big fire, you need to have a central coordinating body. But who was that body? And the absence of leadership that was thinking from diagnosis to injection of vaccines is a problem. And it's still a problem. And you see it in the slow progress that we're making towards better response to the next pandemic. You need to have something that is pushing this and thinking really that it starts with knowing what the disease is and where it is, and it ends only when we can deliver vaccine to everybody.
I'm curious. Why would a country determine and decide to be altruistic, and in so doing, focus on vaccines, focus the tax money that their citizens have in helping people who perhaps don't have the same advantages as they do, without demanding something in return?
That's an interesting question. Countries so altruism, some people argue, is never truly altruistic, that there's always some other motivation. So I think putting that aside, because what is really important is not what a country says, but what a country does.
Yes.
So, there were countries in Europe that said, we will share our vaccine. Well, they eventually did. But it wasn't as quick as we had hoped. I mean, countries banded together for COVAX, right? They committed billions of dollars for COVAX, but the funding wasn't given in exactly the right way. So they couldn't make pre-commitment purchases. So when the vaccines were finally approved, COVAX was the last in line, which meant that a lot of vaccine wasn't available to the later part of the next year. And that was a problem because countries needed a significant amount of vaccine early to vaccinate the populations that were at the greatest risk. And that was the beauty in the WHO's approach. We want to vaccinate the elderly and healthcare workers to protect the people who are taking care of others and to protect the people who are at the greatest risk of dying. I mean, that's the public health approach, but the not getting the formula right was a real issue.
I don't think it's a negative thing to have self-interest, not really. And it isn't a negative thing to want something back in return. That even isn't an issue in my mind. Why I ask the question is because it relates very, very directly to what developing nations and third world countries experience as aid or grants. Now, in cases where you hear of many success stories, it's in partnerships. Because the partnerships then meet the needs that that particular country feel they have, as opposed to the top-down approach that we know what's good for you, so we're going to give it to you and make the best use of it. And if you don't abide by certain sets of rules, then, well, we will see when that happens. Now, if vaccines are available to everyone, then that means that the world in its entirety is a safer place.
And that may be the vested interest of high-income countries. That may be their ultimate interest, that they understand. COVID has taught them that you can't just assume that something that starts in Asia or starts in Africa will remain in that area.
Yeah.
And that in the end, a stronger global system means that they aren't going to see variants of concern arising from countries in Africa that didn't get vaccination, where there are large ongoing epidemics. It means that hopefully the next time Ebola rises, that we will have vaccines against all the different major strains of Ebola and not just against one. You know, we've learned so many lessons over the past 7 years, 8 years now, and not all of them, and many of them have been painful lessons, lessons that have cost millions of lives. And really, when you really think about the pandemic, it wasn't only, $5 trillion. Because if you look at what happened to the global economy, it was set back, and it won't reach where it should have been for a decade. So it's actually many trillions of dollars. When you think about the amount that governments put into programs to help people who are locked down, or who help revive economic activity or sustain it, another set of trillions of dollars. When you look at the value of lives that were lost during the pandemic, many, many trillions of dollars. And then when you finally look at the kids who were locked out of school, that time will never be made up. And it also has in the economist's mind a value. We've lost nearly a year's worth of global production dollars during the pandemic for a large number of different reasons. And for that reason alone, countries around the world, high income, middle income, and low income, should really be committed to solutions that will prevent something like this from happening again.
Indeed. Let's take a break on that note. It's 29 minutes to 8. This is the Situation Room, Kenya's biggest conversation on SpiceFM, KTN Home and online. Dr. Jerome Kim is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. He's here visiting the country from South Korea, where he's based, and he'll be talking about increasing access to affordable vaccines for low and middle income countries such as ourselves. So we have an ongoing outbreak of cholera in several counties around Nairobi and around the country. And in fact, Cambridge scientists are saying, well, we should increase access to the vaccine for cholera so that we can have better treatment of this now. IVI has developed some cholera vaccines for used around the world. We'll be talking about that. The Republic of Kenya has applied to join the IVI as a member state. He'll also be telling us about that as well, and the progress that we've made so far and what we need to do.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
The conversation continues with Jerome Kim from the International Vaccine Institute, live on air with us this morning. So, Jerome, you've told us about the experience that Korea had, with vaccine, and then they decided, okay, we're going to embark on our own long-term program where we will build our own internal capacity. Kenya is on the same path. We are building our own internal capacity, and in fact, we have established the Kenya Biovac Institute, which is the government's commitment to build its own capacity for the production of human vaccines as a long-term measure to ensure Kenya becomes self-sufficient in its vaccine needs and in building security of supply. Now, among the things that we are doing also is applying for membership of IVI. How do those two correlate? Is there any assistance that Kenya is likely to get by being a member state of IVI in its own quest to be self-sufficient in vaccine production?
Yes, so Kenya joining the International Vaccine Institute will allow its voice to be heard by our Board of Trustees, potentially by being elected a member of the board, or by participation in something called the Global Council, which is a new entity actually that starts this year of all the member states of IVI, which will all be invited to come to a general meeting in October of 2023. I think participation is important because we've heard so many times about how we should globalize manufacturing. And what we really need to do is think about manufacturing as not only a factory, because a factory is important, but you need people in that factory who are trained to manufacture vaccines. And vaccines are complex because unlike a chemical, which can be manufactured in a relatively straightforward manner, these are biologicals. So they are grown in living systems and then purified. So the regulations around the quality of vaccines are very important. So you need not only trained people to do the manufacturing, you need to bring the national regulatory authority up to a standard where it can really assure the people of the country that the vaccine can be made reliably and at the same potency with every dose. And then you need to make sure that someone buys the vaccine, which means that, a government may have to make a commitment to its own local manufacturer to purchase the vaccine, because if there's a company that makes a vaccine that no one buys, what will happen? And in the end, this is something that could be shared regionally as well. So there need to be a set of agreements for the use of these vaccines in the region. And thinking end to end, there needs to be a way to give the vaccine. We're really good about giving vaccines to kids. 80% of the world's children get all of the basic recommended vaccines.
Yeah.
We're not so good at vaccinating adults. I mean, in the U.S., it's maybe 30 to 50% of adults get influenza vaccine. It's much lower in many other countries. And as we think about health and the benefit of vaccination, we have to think that vaccines aren't only for kids anymore, that there are a large number of vaccines that really benefit the elderly. And as we think about that, then we have to think about the healthcare system that delivers those vaccines. So really, we're talking about what I call a vaccine ecosystem. It starts with a need for a vaccine. It goes into being able to have the capacity within Kenya to do the research and development. Now, you have great organizations already in existence. KEMRI, the University of Nairobi, the Wellcome Trust KEMRI program in Kilifi. All of these organizations have the capacity to do research and development, but in order to really develop a vaccine, you need money. And I know during the pandemic, people were saying, a big company like Pfizer, it'll cost us $1 billion to make a vaccine. Well, not all vaccines are $1 billion. And it's possible, as long as you have enough funding to take the vaccine from the laboratory through WHO approval for much less than $1 billion. But that is necessary because as you think about what's needed in Africa, what will a vaccine manufacturer here make? Will they make a vaccine that competes with the Serum Institute of India, which can make a vaccine for well under $1? Or will they want to focus on vaccines for the region that are for diseases that are found in Africa or other low and middle income countries? And will that be a sustainable model for vaccine manufacturing? And again, these are questions that we still don't have definitive answers to, but are really important as the government plots its course. And the government of Korea made a decision in 2010. By 2016, there were 2 large manufacturing plants that were public. We call them pilot plants. And then they also created a vaccine research center. And then the next 2 years later, they developed a fund that would take things out of the laboratories and universities and bring them into testing in humans. And then they paid for another set of research and development hubs around vaccines that were necessary for global health, for childhood health, for emerging infectious diseases, and our mRNA. These research and development hubs were supposed to train PhDs, train technicians, give the country an understanding of the technology that is needed to stay at the cutting edge. And then finally, during the pandemic, they put billions of dollars into efforts to create the industry, to strengthen an industry that they wanted to move forward. So in 2010, they were 20% self-sufficient. By 2022, they were 40 to 50% self-sufficient with a goal to be 80% by 2025. So these are things that are possible, but they do require an attention to the entire ecosystem and figuring out how to make sure that Kenya can participate in all the aspects and ultimately have a sustainable manufacturing at the end. And I think that participating with IVI gives them access, allows them a seat at the table, allows their voice to be heard, and really allows them to benefit from the experience of other countries, and also potentially to meet up with other kinds of funders that have an understanding of what it takes.
What's the process of joining the IVI?
So I'd like to say it's simple, but not having been in this kind of part of government, it's actually much more complicated. So the government makes a formal request to join, and this is usually a letter or now an email to the board of IVI. Within 2 weeks, the board usually accepts new members. And then the government has to, through its own process, approve accessing a treaty-based organization, and then has to send a formal letter notifying the United Nations, the Secretary General's office, that they are joining. And then they're registered. And we receive an email back from the United Nations saying Kenya's joined. Starting next year, the Global Council will pick the non-funding members to sit on the board. Up to this point, because we didn't have a Global Council, the board picked non-funding members. So it's possible actually to have a voice on the Board of Trustees.
As early as next year.
Right, as early as next year.
I have to ask two questions. One, what criteria do they use for selecting the non-paying members? And are there cases where an application has been declined?
So no cases where an application has been declined. In the case of so ultimately, when the Global Council picks the members, I think they will pick the members based on location, because again, you want some geographic balance, need, and interest. So some countries are much more interested and actually very rapidly put forward nominees, and other countries took a longer time. And then the qualifications of the country's participation. And is this a country?
Could you explain that a bit?
Right.
Yes.
Is this a country that has a growing or is planning to develop a vaccine manufacturing industry? Is this a country that has an interest in participating in the clinical trials or some other aspect of vaccine development? Is this a country that has a large vaccine industry, for instance, India, with its very large vaccine industry? So all of these questions are things that the Global Council will consider as it's picking a member. But ultimately, these are recommendations. The Global Council has to decide what participation is best. Having Ecuador and Rwanda as members on the board has been really valuable. We've gotten a lot of participation and insights from the members from the representatives that the two countries sent. I think it was the right decision. Should we have even more participation from other member states? I think so. But again, the board is effective because it's relatively small. And IVI is a little bit different from the United Nations or the World Health Organization, because really it has product development at its core. And in that sense, we're a little bit like a research institute at a university. Yeah. Because we develop vaccines in a laboratory, we test the vaccines in animals, and then we're a little bit like a biotech company that takes a vaccine and tests it in humans with a goal to have that vaccine approved. And then we're a little bit more like a partner to governments, as that vaccine has now been approved by the World Health Organization, but we don't really have real-world experience with it. And that real-world experience is important because we hope that the vaccine behaves when it's used in big populations the same way it did in a clinical trial with 10,000 people. But we can't always be sure. And that evidence is really important because when a country commits to vaccinate its population, it's committing millions of dollars of public funding and the time of healthcare workers. Yeah. So it really, we have to be absolutely certain that these vaccines are effective. We can make all the recommendations we want, but unless we secure cooperation and buy-in from member countries, then we really aren't going to be able to do our job.
But if I may say so, the very process you've just described, let me say this tongue-in-cheek, is like a necessary evil in that you cannot know how a vaccine will be responded to in a large group until and unless it is given to that large group. So perhaps the cautionary processes that ensure that even as it's going on, it's being monitored, it's being studied, so that if there's a need to alter, to change, to do things that would ensure that safety continues is in place.
That's a brilliant thought because, and it's exactly what we do. For instance, oral cholera vaccine. So it's very important. It's in short supply. There's actually more demand right now than there is supply of vaccine. But it's not perfect. It's not perfect because even though we've made, the companies have made some improvements in the way it's packaged. It used to come in glass vials with a metal cap. And can you imagine taking off 80,000 metal caps? You actually need a hemostat, a little device to ply off the top. If you're doing mass vaccinations, this is not an easy thing to do. It's an oral vaccine, so once you get the cap off, you can, pour it into a child's mouth or an adult's mouth. But just the act of doing that is not efficient. So one of the companies came up with a plastic pack. So they're like the little eye drops that you use, and you snap off the plastic pack, twist off the top, and squirt, and that's it. That single innovation allows you to pack more vaccine in a box, which makes it much easier to transport and deliver to the sites where it's needed. But at the same time, we already knew that the vaccine doesn't work particularly well in babies. And it's been a problem for these oral vaccines to work effectively in children under 5. So the next step is to work on a vaccine that we can inject that will work better in those children. And then, of course, we have MSF, Doctors Without Borders, saying, well, we still have to transport these large pallets of vaccine that have to be kept cold, and we really need something that's stable at room temperature, that's in a pill that we can just pop in somebody's mouth. And so we're working on that as well. So this is a process of continuous improvement based on complaints or observations from the
user
field.
feedback.
Exactly, user feedback. And it's really important because we want vaccines to be used and used effectively. We're working on a technology with different companies that would allow us to put vaccines on a patch. And vaccines on a patch are really a great concept. The Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, has prioritized this new technology. But for instance, you wouldn't need a nurse anymore. The vaccine on a patch can be handed out to somebody in the village, a village leader, and you take the backing off and you put it on. 5 minutes later, you take it off, and it's done.
Sure.
No needle. But those kinds of technologies are improvements on vaccines that, big vaccine companies like Pfizer and Merck already have. They're not really interested in the patch. But smaller companies,
Would be.
Indian companies, Korean companies, are interested in it because the technology offers a significant advance. And for global health, these advances are critical. So it's exactly your point that we need the information from the field in order to confirm what we found. When we do a phase 3 trial, we really look at protection of an individual because that's what the way the trials are done is to eliminate any form of bias. So we get a scientifically correct answer. It's almost like a lab experiment, right? We are answering a particular question about protection of an individual. But what a country is interested in is protection of individuals, but they want to know, does it protect our population?
Sure.
And that population-based data is something we can only really get when we do these large effectiveness studies, which are still a part of testing of a vaccine. They also give us much more information about safety. Something, a negative side effect that occurs at a frequency of 1 in 50,000 isn't necessarily going to be picked up in a trial of 10,000 people. So we really need to have systems in place to do the evaluation of the vaccines and to follow safety. And this is all a part of, we call it the first 3 phases, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. You remember these from COVID. Phase 3 is where we test for safety and whether the vaccine is doing what it's supposed to do. The phase 4 is when we test it in human populations, which is actually ultimately what it was for. And if we can't do that, so for instance, the malaria vaccine, WHO would not give a recommendation until it had been tested in a much larger population so that we could actually look at the effect in the real world. And now there's a formal recommendation and maybe an even better vaccine coming up. But you have to do that because countries will invest millions of dollars and the time of very valuable healthcare workers to do vaccination programs. And we really want to make sure that money is effectively spent.
Sure. As you look at this, I'm talking about, big pharmaceutical companies around the world and the work that they do. Would you say IVI is in direct competition to or an alternative for big pharma?
That's a great question. But, and I think the best way to think about it is we're not in competition at all. Why is that? Because the diseases we work on, we consider, we call them unincentivized. Unincentivized meaning you're not going to make $1 billion making a oral cholera vaccine. And so a big company like Sanofi may not particularly be interested in a vaccine where, they make 30 million doses at $1.30 a dose. That's not how a company makes profit for its shareholders. And that's not a bad thing, because out of these companies is coming enormous innovation, right? I mean, we have vaccines against pneumonia, vaccines against cervical cancer, vaccines against hepatitis, vaccines against malaria. But many of the vaccines will generate a profit for the company. Cholera vaccine, typhoid conjugate vaccine, these are not vaccines that are high profit. So we're working in an area where there's a gap. And we're kind of proud to work in this area because really these are vaccines for diseases that are found primarily in low and middle income countries. And the big pharmaceutical companies have very little interest in developing vaccines for those diseases. I mean, we call them neglected diseases. But in fact, there are even groups of diseases that don't make the World Health Organization's list of neglected diseases that kill even more people. And so we work in that space, and we don't compete. And we don't manufacture. Our Constitution prohibits us from manufacturing a vaccine, so we believe in the process of technology transfer to what we call developing country vaccine manufacturers. And so we've done 9 different technology transfers to companies around the world. And I think that's an important part of what we do.
Looking at the funding model, so 80% of your funds come from grants. Institutes such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust. Is this a sustainable model?
It has been. And I think maybe COVID represents a remarkable turn, an opportunity for us, because we recognize, I think globally, there are now countries and development banks and charitable foundations that understand that maybe one of the great failings of our response to the pandemic was that we were too dependent on manufacturing in particular regions of the world. I mean, India was a remarkable producer of COVID vaccines, but some of the vaccine that was destined for COVAX was taken by the Indian government because it needed vaccine at home, right? And so it's not that different from what happened with the United States or what happened to Korea in 2010. So having sustainable regional manufacturing is an important part of what countries around the world need to do in order to be better prepared during a pandemic. And it's again, you have to look at the entire ecosystem, because the last thing we would want would be to put a vaccine manufacturing plant in every country in the world or every country in Africa and have them sit idle. I mean, if the purpose were to make COVID vaccines, how many people are being vaccinated with COVID vaccines in Kenya now? Or in the United States, for that matter. What you need is a vaccine to make in between pandemics. And that's really a critical step, because why train people? Why build a factory? Why put in all the infrastructure necessary? Why strengthen your regulatory authority? All of these things are important for a vaccine ecosystem.
And that's why I'm asking, Jerome. So if you look at, in the absence of a philanthropic billionaire who wants to do good for the world, how else would you fund your operations in a more sustainable manner that you don't actually have to wait for? If Bill and Melinda Gates decided our focus is no longer on vaccines, it's something else, your funding goes.
So you definitely need funding. And so for that reason, IVI is almost always an advocate for global health. I mean, we have to be, because ultimately someone has to talk to those billionaires or to governments or to other organizations that fund research and development. And when you think, the oral cholera vaccine cost the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from start to finish $28 million. The typhoid conjugate vaccine cost them $29 million. We actually returned $4 million to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But it was important to have the funding to go from the laboratory all the way through approval. If we had to, as we do for some vaccines, start in the laboratory, get a grant. When it's done, we wait another year as the next grant is being brought online, and we get funding to move it into the final stages right before being tested in humans. Then we wait another year, 2 years to get funding to take it into human clinical trials. And you can see the delays adding up. Partners change, science changes, and by the time we're ready for phase 3, which will be a lot more money, $10 million, $20 million, we don't have the same. The disease has changed. It may not be in the area that we were looking at before. It may be we have to find new areas, and we may have a better way to make the vaccine. So again, we have to be we have to be effective advocates for the need for funding for research and development. And I think, COVID again has focused our attention on this.
Shown the way to go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for joining us. And thank you for shedding light on the IVI and the work that you've been doing, and also where Kenya fits into that entire matrix of IVI. Jerome Kim is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. He's been our guest this morning, talking about increasing access to affordable vaccines for particularly low and middle income countries such as ourselves. Thank you very much for keeping it locked.